freedom of speech, well, how does a community understand who its true leaders are? It's by this process of communication. And it's by utilizing the platforms that technology affords us in order to understand these various messages that are going to come to us. But you can look at Fox and you can look at CNN and you can look at MSNBC. And at the end, you get the same message. So that's not freedom of speech, and it certainly isn't freedom of thinking, freedom of thought. There's Wall Street. There's sort of like this public system, or you think it's public, and then you find out it's not. It's not. It's a bunch of fat cats sitting around a table, and they're dividing up the world, basically. And they have the resources, the wherewithal to get that done. And so they do it. And we don't ever look at the Federal Reserve. We don't look at the dollars. We don't look at the manipulation.
Welcome back to Liberty and Finance. We have a distinguished guest for the first time today. Cynthia McKinney served 12 years as a member of the United States Congress, House of Representatives. She was elected 6 times by the people of the state of Georgia. Her latest book is When China Sneezes, From Coronavirus Lockdowns to the Global Politico-Economic Crisis, which just came out this year. She's been a champion against corruption in Washington, D.C. We're going to talk about that. She was appalled by the proportion of U.S. homeless that are veterans. She's worked tirelessly to improve the plight of veterans in the U.S., and she's also internationally renowned for taking her arguments about human rights to the actual places where the action is at, putting herself in harm's way with other teams of journalists to stand up for such things as the rights of people in Gaza, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Also traveling to Libya just before a U.S. NATO operations against that country. So she's put herself where the action is at. She's walked her talk. She holds a BA from the University of Southern California, a master's from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and a PhD from Antioch University. Thank you for joining us, Cynthia McKinney, this Monday, November 16th, 2020.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to come on your show. Actually, I was a viewer of your show, and you had a guest, Dr. Vieira, and he was saying the same things that I've been thinking. And so I reached out to you. I tried to find you. I reached out to you. I reached out to him. And you put me in touch with him. And so these are valued connections. And then the next thing I know, you were asking me to come on your show. So thank you very much.
Well, I had been aware of you also because we had G. Edward Griffin on way back in the beginning. We started this in December of 2013. So we had him on as one of our first guests, and we've participated directly as part of the media team in last year's Red Pill Expo in Hartford, Connecticut. Anyway, knowing that you've been a speaker at some Red Pill Expos and seen some of your bio there, I was aware of your name from that contact as well. But could you just take a couple minutes and explain to our audience, because you've been so involved in trying to make a difference. A lot of us are concerned, the former name of our channel was Reluctant Preppers, the idea that we're preparing reluctantly because we don't think that this is how the world should be, but it is, and we're taking it as it is and trying to make sure we can take care of our families and our communities and so on. But you've done much more than just take care of your family and your community. You've tried to make a difference in the world in a big way, year after year after year, at great cost to you politically and personally, and putting yourself in danger, etc. But you did it anyway. So how does a person, if you could just tell us what inspired you to take such a role in your life to do what you did?
Donegan, I have to say, I have to admit that while I have a lot of things on my resume or, things that I've done, and it really was trying to sort of shake some sense into these people and to stop these interminable wars. But the reluctant preppers were focused on taking care of themselves and their families. And actually, I harmed my family in the process of doing all of that. So I have to look now that I'm out of that scene altogether, I have to look back and say, there needs to be a balance, and I didn't have a balance. I only have balance now because my father died, and I was forced to take another look at things, and I realized that I've sacrificed a lot in terms of the security of my family, and now I have to focus on other things. So you could say I'm a reluctant prepper too, but I'm coming to it very late. But the idea of the world being not what we want it to be, and we know that there's a better way. What our challenge is to try and figure out how we can make it a better world and how we can find that better way. I think you asked me about, well, what motivates you? Well, the civil rights movement was a big motivation for me, because in that movement, I was able to see what the United States used to be and what the United States was becoming, in the process of becoming. And I witnessed the power of personal transformation, so that change was not something to be feared. Change was something to be embraced. And personal change was also something to be embraced. And that's basically the beginning of how I ended up doing the things that I've done. It's all been about, and what I've studied as well, because I have studied leadership and change, and the change component of how you lead change, how you manage change, how you can even invite personal level change, individual level change, and be accepting of that. Those are lessons that I've learned in various spheres. And anyway, so I look forward to change.
Well, that's one of the things that I think we're all being thrust into now, no matter what walk of life you come from, no matter what social, political, ethnic group you belong to. We are facing unprecedented levels of changes that are swirling around us. But what I was getting at was, when you talked about the civil rights movement, we are now all quite concerned, and should be, about our civil rights. And that's one of the themes I wanted to visit together with you, is that and it was touched on quite strongly in Dr. Vieira's interview that we referenced, but the freedom of speech in the face of big tech and big media censorship, and then the free and honest election, so that our voice is actually heard and we're not disenfranchised. That's not affecting just any one constituency or subsection of Americans. It's affecting Americans. So can you talk to us about what your biggest concerns are, and where you think promise lies, and where the heavy lifting is that we need to do to reclaim, I guess, our civil rights as a people?
Okay, well, if you're going to have a republic which requires the institution of voting, then you've got to have honest elections. But, as a country, we have never had honest elections. Have we had elections to the level of corruption that we've witnessed in 2020? Well, I don't know. It depends on your values, because at the founding of our country, women and the Africans that were here were not allowed to vote. And so you had elections, but were those democratic elections in the sense of what we accept now? No, they weren't. So I think that and we have to sort of understand the good and the bad, the reality and the desirable as we are sort of figuring out our position in terms of the values that we represent in the elections. So these honest elections, freedom of speech. Well, I mean, when speech becomes equated with money, then is that really speech, or are we enjoying freedom of speech? So I guess you could say that you're hedging in many different ways because things are not so clear cut. And I guess in the end, what's required is that we actually engage in a conversation so that we engage in a communal conversation about what's important. What do we mean when we say these things? What does it mean in our political life to have this as an outcome and this as an outcome? These are things that we need to talk about. We need to discuss. It's our citizenship. But people don't talk about citizenship anymore. I mean, it's almost a sacred thing. And it's our expression of not only who we are, but it's also the expression of the kind of country in which we want to live and what our country means on the world stage. What is it that it means for us to be an American or a US citizen, I like to say? But what does it mean? What kind of US do we want to have portrayed to the rest of the world? These are questions that we ought to be engaged in on a regular basis. This is the conversation that we need to have. And maybe if more of us pay more attention to the values that animate us, and then the values that we want our country to demonstrate to the rest of the world, maybe we'll pay a little bit more attention and things won't get so bad as they are now. But things are horrible. things are really horrible. And because of the things that I've done and the ideas that I've had, I couldn't get a job here after I was kicked out of the Congress with these same electronic voting machines. This is a system that has been put in place. Democrats and Republicans are guilty of this. This kind of swamp. The swamp is not just the Democratic Party, although what we're witnessing today is a whole lot of swamp from the Democratic Party. Joe Biden has been a swamp monster for a very long time. This is not anything new. And when the Democrats decided that they were going to select Joe Biden, he's a plagiarist. As a person who's worked in academia, I love being in an academic setting. I love doing research. I love reading and checking the footnotes and seeing the validity of the footnotes. I love all of that. So in that particular world, plagiarism is like the highest crime. And Joe Biden he just had to beg his way out of law school because why? Because he plagiarized. And then he had to end his presidential aspirations when he was running for president. Why? Because he plagiarized a speech from the UK. I mean, this is a person who's a serial liar, and plagiarism is basically lying. And so we shouldn't be surprised at the laptop from Hunter Biden. I mean, this is part and parcel of everything that we should have thrown away if we had been engaged in civics and in our communities with our leadership or elected representatives of authority not necessarily leaders, because you don't have to be a leader in order to get elected. You would hope that your leaders are elected, but oftentimes the true community leaders are the ones that are pushed down. And so this idea of freedom of speech, well, how does a community understand who its true leaders are? It's by this process of communication. And it's by utilizing the platforms that technology affords us in order to understand these various messages that are going to come to us. But you can look at Fox, and you can look at CNN, and you can look at MSNBC, and at the end, you get the same message. So that's not freedom of speech, and it certainly isn't freedom of thinking, freedom of thought. And so our people, instead of promoting critical analysis and critical thinking, the opposite occurs. And so people are being demonetized. I was put in Facebook jail for like about 9 months. And I couldn't even post on my Facebook page. Twitter hides you. And then, of course, there's the invisible way that they deny you access to a platform that was created, by the way, through the US government taxpayers' research and development. I mean, this is not some private enterprise that innovated this new technology. It came from the government. It came from me, and it came from you. And then, of course, by way of corruption, you get certain people are given access to the patents, and then, they are able to develop a business out of what you and I contributed to. So the corruption is pervasive. It's above a political party, but it's not above us. And it shouldn't be above the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
So when we look at what's happening now with these electronic voting machines, you see Georgia, my home state, was the first state to deploy the electronic voting machines. And I watched the process of deciding that we're going to get an inferior product rather than the superior product, because the inferior product allows us to do all kinds of manipulations to the people's will. At the time, there was an accountant. His name was Ethan Gibbs. And he looked at this problem of voting after the fiasco of 2000. He looked at the problem of voting from the point of view of an accountant. So what he wanted to build into his system was reliability, so the computers wouldn't fail. Redundancy, so that if there were a problem, that the whole system wouldn't go down. Privacy, because we have a constitutional right to privacy in casting our vote. And then also auditability, so that I, as a citizen, could make a phone call, give my randomly generated code, and then I could get back, yes, your vote was counted. Because believe me, what has happened in the past, even before the advent of electronic voting machines, was that you had a lot of votes thrown out. And so they were called overvotes or undervotes. There were all these different labels that were attached to ballots that were not filled out correctly. And so those votes were just basically thrown out. And you had the issue of whose votes were thrown out. Unfortunately, the facts is that a large number of those votes that were thrown out were Black votes. Hence the problem with the Voting Rights Act and all of that came along. And that's how we know where the votes were thrown out. Well, anyway, so then after the fiasco of 2000, we get this mandate to implement a new electronic voting system across the country. And Georgia was the first one to take it on. I watched as Ethan Gibbs, the accountant, presented his machine, and it had everything, including open source code. And instead, Diebold, which is the predecessor of Dominion, I'm told by my lawyer, Diebold hired a relative of the leadership of the Georgia House of Representatives. And so then, of course, that meant that Diebold had the inside track. And the Diebold machine, which was hackable, inferior in every way, and later we found out that the systems fail in the heat. Well, have you ever been to Georgia in the summertime? And so the systems failed. Well, anyway, Diebold was selected, and then, of course, I got hoisted on the petard of Diebold since I was championing Ethan Gibbs. Now, the situation is that I was accepted into the Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley PhD program. So I went out there. They were having an orientation for PhD students. And I went out there and I asked Ethan Gibbs to accompany me so that he could give a demonstration of his machine in California. He was scheduled to go to Ohio. If you remember, back in 2000, Ohio was one of those states that had a fiasco with the voting machines as well. They were not electronic at that time, but it was just that they had too few machines in certain precincts, and they had, so that meant that there were huge lines, people waiting 6 and 7 hours to vote. And he was going to Ohio the following weekend. During that weekend when I was in California and I had invited him to join me, Ethan Gibbs was going home. His home was in Tennessee. A truck, a semi tractor trailer truck, was idling for an hour. And when Ethan Gibbs came down the road, the highway, the truck pulled off and Ethan Gibbs was killed. So he was never able to give the presentation in Ohio that probably would have seen Ohio adopt his machine. So then everyone went and they, went with the corrupt leader, which was Diebold. The Diebold machines were totally unreliable and they were hackable as well. Bev Harris of Black Box Voting basically lived in Georgia with me because Georgia was rife with problems with these machines. And in fact, she then invited me to accompany her to Florida, where she was going to demonstrate, those were the ES&S machines, and she was going to demonstrate the hackability of the ES&S machines. And so we sat there and a kid in 3 clicks of the mouse was able to hack inside the machine and change it was a mock election, and was able to change the outcome of the election. So this is not a new problem. This is a problem that has existed with the inception of these machines and the corruption around the decision making to choose the machine that facilitated the changing of election outcomes. If you recall, Hillary Clinton made a comment. She said, it's okay if they have an election just as long as we know the outcome of the election. Well, this is how. So the United States has deployed this software in other countries. No wonder other countries don't like the United States, because we interfere in the internal affairs of other countries, which is part of the reason why I was an international relations major at University of Southern California. And of course, the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy prepares our diplomatic corps. And so I was primed, you could say, to serve on the House International Relations Committee. And so I knew fully well the history of U.S. interference in the affairs of other countries. What I didn't understand at that time, but what is clear now, is that these systems were deployed to change the outcome. So you say, okay, we want to make a democratic system where there was an authoritarian system before, say, or maybe it was a dictatorship or whatever. And so the world looks at that and said, oh, that's wonderful. But what they don't understand is the corruption that even goes along with these color revolutions. So, for example, you have a situation where you want to antagonize the Soviet Union. Back at that time, it's the Soviet Union. You want to antagonize the Soviet Union, and you want to make sure that you carry NATO straight up to the Russian border. So you do that. And at the same time, you cannot allow Tito's Yugoslavia to become a model that other countries that are coming out of colonialism might follow. So what do? You have to destroy Yugoslavia, and you have to Balkanize Yugoslavia. And that's how we got all the former ethnic enclaves within Yugoslavia. Was a balancing act. And then, of course, when the United States went in with Milosevic and Serbia and Kosovo, well, what happened? A new country that the world still doesn't recognize yet, Kosovo, was created from the allies of the United States with the Kosovo Liberation Army, which were dealing the drugs in Europe. So the United States created a narco state. And then as a result of that, the largest new military base in Europe is in Kosovo. So that threatens the balance that exists now, today, because Camp Bondsteel. Not only that, but you have the people who created this new state receiving contracts from this new state. Like Madeleine Albright went there and she was trying to get a contract, and it happens over and over again. So basically, we've been told that the purpose of these color revolutions is to instill democracy in parts of the world so that we can appear to be noble. But in fact, we've got some ignoble behavior going on with these newly, quote unquote, liberated states, where the profiteers come in and they are trying to profit from the tragedy of these other countries. And that's happened in Myanmar. Look, I was teaching and I've been to Myanmar several times. I go to these places and I understand. Now I understand fully. I didn't see it at the time, of course, but now I understand fully that this is just a racket. It's a racket, like Smedley Butler said. war is a racket. And the United States has been engaged in a racket. Certain people in the United States that we can call it the swamp have been engaged in a racket for a very long time. If we can, if through the overreach of the Democrats in this 2020 election, if we can finally drain the swamp, as Trump's attorneys, Lynn Wood and Sidney Powell, are now indicating, it will be a fabulous day. It would be like a rebirth.
A lot of people who are hoping and waiting and got their fingers crossed for a truthful and, I guess, constitutionally valid outcome from this have exactly that hope in mind. Along the way, you mentioned this long track record of these influenceable or corruptible voting machines. So sounds like it may be just a big open secret in Washington that we've been using as a tool of so-called world transformation or nation building internationally for decades. And so only now has it reared its head to this extent in the U.S. So two thoughts come to mind. Is that true, that this is like this big open secret, and how ironic? But secondly, that a lot of the posturing about objections to foreign interference in U.S. elections is a lot of self-righteous posturing if we've been involved in that in other countries.
Oh, we absolutely have been involved in that in other countries. There's no doubt about that. And in fact, I was down in Mexico City. I was protesting with the women who had decided that they were going to just sort of draw a line in the oil, where the United States wanted to basically steal the electricity from Mexico electricity grid, and Pemex, of course, which is their state-owned oil company, petroleum. And so the people were saying, no, we've had enough. And not only have we had enough, we don't want to be forced to come to the United States as a labor pool, as a labor policy, and leave our families in Mexico. We have a right not to have to immigrate. Imagine that. So anyway, I was down there, and AMLO was in the Manuel Lopez Obrador, who is currently the president of Mexico. He had run before, and the same thing that happened in my own database technologies, same thing that happened. Database technologies went down there, and people would go to the polls and they say, oh, well, you can't vote. You've already voted. It's the same thing, the same exact thing, vote flipping, ghost votes, phantom votes. Those are the things that happened to me, and that ended up with me being kicked out of the Congress. Now I understand. We got affidavits from people all over the state of Georgia who got my ballot on their electronic voting machine, but they were not in my district. And so I just recently contacted my lawyer because when Hammer, it was Sidney Powell who mentioned Hammer and scorecard. And you've got this General McInerney who has been explaining how Hammer and scorecard work. And I said, well, that's what they were testing it out in my race. They were testing it out. And so you had this nationalist, USA first versus globalist being played out inside the Democratic Party when this technology was very new. And they used it against me. I have the legal case in court. Of course, we didn't have money. We didn't have any money to do the appeal because, of course, the judiciary is a swamp too. And so but all of these things that happened in 2020 happened to me in my congressional race. And that was when electronic voting was very new. And we weren't able to get any kind of justice. And of course, we weren't able to overturn any election which is why you introduced me as former member of Congress. But now we have a chance. Now we have a chance that in fact, let me just tell you that the expert witness for the state of Georgia in the court, in the trial, said, and this is almost a quote, "You just have to trust that the winner we announce is the actual winner." Now that was in my court case because we had vote flipping, everything, and the state of Georgia said that, well, all we were asking for was the election data. We wanted to know how these votes that were cast outside of my district, how were they treated? Were they counted? Were they not? I mean, what was going on here? And the response from the state of Georgia is that, well, the software belongs to Diebold. Now something has happened so that the Trump administration will not have that as an answer, even though they want to say, Dominion wants to say it's proprietary software, but they can't say that because of the executive order that was signed by Trump in 2018, September, that created the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, CISA.gov for your audience. And they can go there and they can see. So this discussion about watermarks and codes, according to CISA, most of the ballots that people voted on had a mark on them, had some kind of code. Some of the ballots had a watermark as well. So now we're in a whole different scenario where the electronic voting machines have been lifted up as a national security concern, and the servers that were strewn all over the world now come under the jurisdiction of the US military. And so that's how they were able to be seized. And I am hopeful that we will get down to the bottom of just exactly what happened on November 3rd, 2020.
Well, there's enough there to keep us busy for a week. I just wanted to follow up on one thing that you mentioned early on, and you said that the swamp isn't owned entirely by one party or another. We have a question from Pete Gerard. Quote, "Two wings of the same bird is a common meme to illustrate the faux power duality between the political parties in Washington. Was there ever a time when Cynthia first came to this realization about where real power lay?"
Oh, on my very good question, very interesting, because, as someone who was there and saw things that I didn't quite understand when I was a freshman. But now, of course, okay, my disillusionment came when we were having I was elected as a Democrat. Of course, I blexed it a long time ago, but I was elected as a Democrat, and I really believed my committee chairman. I'm on the House International Relations Committee, and we're having a very contentious hearing. So I get there early, and I'm there, and my chairman is there, and I want to back up my chairman. And what I saw during the entire hearing was they were going at each other because he was from the opposition, right? The witness was an oppositional witness. So we're going after each other. When the hearing concluded, they walked out arm in arm. It was all theater. I didn't know it at the time. So then that made me open my eyes and get out of this sort of starry world, perfect world that I had been lifted up by my constituents to go to Washington, D.C. to look out for them. And there were all of these impediments in the way. I loved my constituents. These were my constituents that first sent me to Washington were some of the poorest people in the country. I had never seen this kind of poverty before because, I grew up middle class, and so I had never seen this kind of poverty. People go home after they're, doing the fish fry and they're volunteering in the church and they don't have running water in their homes. And, I'd never seen this before. So these people went to Washington with me. They raised their hand with me. I loved them. Well, anyway, the impediments to loving your constituents are many because the whole goal is to have you loving the power, to have you loving the money, to have you loving the position, everything. You have to love that more than you love your constituents.
There's a follow-up question here from Pete Gerard who says, does Cynthia subscribe to the other quote, permit me to issue and control the money of a nation and I care not who makes its laws? And if so, who does she think is behind the curtain?
That's a difficult question too. You guys are asking me tough questions, but well, of course, that's one aspect of power and control over the US state that hasn't been dealt with either. And so you've got people like Ellen Brown that are pushing for public banking. You've got G. Edward Griffin. You mentioned G. Edward Griffin earlier. I participated in the Red Pill just on Jekyll Island just this maybe 2 months ago. So it's impossible to ignore the financial system. There's Wall Street. There's sort of like this public system, or you think it's public, and then you find out it's not. It's not. It's a bunch of fat cats sitting around a table, and they're dividing up the world, basically. And they have the resources, the wherewithal to get that done. And so they do it. And we don't ever look at the Federal Reserve. We don't look at the dollars. We don't look at the manipulation of not only currencies, but I had bought some gold coins because Mike Rupert had told me to buy gold a long time ago. And I don't know if your audience would be familiar with Mike Rupert, but Mike Rupert is was because he's no longer with us. But Mike Rupert was the LAPD. He had come from a CIA family because, CIA basically deals with families. So it's the parents and the children become the recruits. And that's how you get this intergenerational. And it's not just CIA, FBI was like that too under COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program was like that too. So the father was carrying out things, and then the son took the father's place and began to carry out these actions against U.S. citizens. Well, anyway, so Mike Rupert, the Black community is trying to figure out how this crack cocaine is coming into our community. It's affecting every Black family in the country, including my own. And we're not dealing any drugs except, on street level. We're not bringing them in. So how is this happening to us? Well, basically, what had happened was during the Iran-Contra scenario, the United States didn't want the Sandinistas to gain control to overthrow the government which was a dictatorship in Nicaragua. And the Sandinistas were on the verge of winning. So the United States needed to create a counter force of rebels like ISIS, like Daesh, like Boko Haram, like Al-Shabaab. It's the same template, just different location, right? Different part of the world. And so the United States created the Contras and said they're fighting for democracy.
Freedom
Well, it
fighters.
was freedom fighters. That's right. And but the Congress cut off the funding and said this is wrong. And so then how is the CIA going to finance this operation? Because they were going to stop. That's not going to happen. How many times has Congress said stop and the Congress actually stopped? Remember, it was made equivalent to the Matrix. Total information awareness, and that whole project. And so it just got another name in the Pentagon and carried right on, right? So the same thing happened, and how Oliver North and those guys financed the Contras against the Sandinistas in Nicaragua was by the creation of crack cocaine. There was no such thing as crack cocaine until this operation began. So they understood the Black community as the target. The Black community couldn't afford cocaine, powder cocaine, couldn't afford it. So if you want to pull get people addicted to drugs, now the British did this to the Chinese. That's with the opium wars.
Yeah.
That's right. So now this is not, I'm not saying anything that hasn't happened historically. It did happen. It's the way certain individuals lead their countries, their states. It's statecraft. When you don't want to pay a fair price for the resources. Back then with the Chinese, the British the British people fell in love with the tea. And they were selling the tea, buying the tea, and giving the Chinese their silver. And they said, wait, we're giving so much silver, we've got to be able to get this stuff for free. And so then they said, okay, well, we'll just get the whole country of Chinese people addicted to opium. And the Chinese fought back. But the British were able to get a toehold on the mainland, which is Hong Kong. And then as a result of the Civil War and everything that ensued after that, the United States supported the other side, Chiang Kai-shek, against Mao, and they fled to Taiwan. And that's how you have Hong Kong as a semi kind of British protectorate, and you've got Taiwan as the US protectorate, which the United States is doing the saber rattling now in the South China Sea. So anyway, back to North America. So the United States found a drug dealer, a Black male drug dealer, and they said, you can have all the cocaine you want. And he said, okay, well then let me figure out how I can make it affordable for Black people. And that's how crack cocaine was created. It's an operation of the U.S. government to finance its purported foreign policy objectives in Central America. My family paid a price, and every Black family in this country paid a price so that the United States could defeat the Sandinistas, which they didn't do because Daniel Ortega is the president of Nicaragua today. It didn't work. They were not able to supersede the people's will. So Mike Rupert exposed all of this because as a Los Angeles police officer, he was a detective. He had been, and he came from a CIA family. He had been asked to help with the distribution, to look the other way as this cocaine was coming into the U.S. from LA coming into the US and then being distributed across the country. And at the height of the crack cocaine tragedy, Juanita Millender McDonald, who is a congresswoman from South Central LA, held a town hall meeting where she told the CIA director, come in and you respond to my constituents who are upset. And it was Mike Rupert who stood up, white guy, in a sea of all of these Black people. And he exposed the whole plot. So Mike Rupert became my friend, my very, very dear, dear, dear friend. And he's no longer with us either. Gary Webb from the San Jose Mercury News wrote the story. I tried to recruit Gary Webb to come and work in my congressional office and conduct an investigation so that we could have a real investigation of what happened. Of course, you know, Gary Webb is no longer with us too. So I've mentioned 3 heroes, 3 U.S. heroes. I've mentioned Athan Gibbs, Gary Webb, Mike Rupert, and they're all dead. And they didn't die from old age. So anyway, it was Rupert who told me, buy gold. And I did buy gold. I bought some gold coins, and then when I got kicked out of the Congress, I needed the money, so I turned them in. And now my son is asking me, well, you know, he wants to buy gold. And I'm telling him, okay, well, let's watch the price. But gold is manipulated too. Gold and silver, they're all manipulated. So when is it that we can have markets that are actually free? When?
Markets and media and tech and elections and education and yeah.
Yes.
That's why we're here. I mean, our tagline is helping people be aware and prepared. So your fight, lifelong, has been about awareness and truth in the face of corruption and injustice. And there's clearly, we've scratched half a dozen subjects here. There's about 10 more we didn't get to. We will need to circle back with you another time. We're just very grateful for your presence here with us, and thank you for reaching out and for getting connected with Dr. Vieira and trying to support the cause of spreading truth in this critical election. And we just are grateful for you, Cynthia McKinney. And if people want to follow you and find out more about your ongoing work, where should they get connected?
Well, I'm on Twitter, and I'm on Facebook. And I have my website, but I need to update my website. Please pardon me, people in the audience, please pardon me. But I welcome people to communicate with me because that's how I learn. And I truly enjoy interacting with folks. So please, out there in the cyber world, please look me up.
If you could make sure that we have your latest connections on all those platforms, we'll stick those in the description of this video so people can find you. And we just thank you for joining us here on Liberty and Finance.
Thank you so much, Dunnigan, for inviting me.
To acquire gold and silver, just go to libertyandfinance.com. When the main site comes up, click on Bullion Sales. That's libertyandfinance.com, Bullion Sales. You'll see my name, Dunnigan Kaiser, my phone number, and my associate, Kaiser Johnson, his phone number, our email, libertyandfinance@protonmail.com.